This video is about the discussion between Danny Haiphong and Brian Berletic about US-China tensions. The link to the full video between Danny and Brian will be in the description area. The whole reason is to share the information with others and hopefully will encourage people to do some research and look into the facts, and not be misled by the Western media. I only clip out about 30 minutes of their conversation because I believe it could be called the playbook against China, and it might also explain to others why the US government is doing what they are doing with regards to China, even at the expense of putting American citizens into poverty while doing it. Please remember that the US government used to spend $300 million a year to smear China, which recently was increased to $500 million. All these was to create hatred and demonizing of the Chinese people so that American citizens will be anti-Chinese, so they will blindly support the American government on their crazy scheme to sabotage every country that is trying to become more powerful and overtake the US.
Blinken visited last few weeks, and it seems like unraveled everything after Biden made some colorful comments about Xi Jinping being a dictator. Now Janet Yellen is supposedly going to visit China in July. China is very suspicious that this is literally all about just U.S. interests, economic interests. The U.S. economy is not doing so hot, and there's a whole debt crisis, and so where are things right now, given the Blinken visit was supposedly going to be this watershed moment in stabilizing relations? It doesn't seem like that occurred at all. And then following it, it seems like there was a lot of unraveling. What's your take?
There's a reason we always eventually talk about China after talking about the NATO proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, because the US, NATO, Europe, this is their whole plan, is to encircle and contain Russia and China. And this isn't a recent plan that they've developed. These aren't recent foreign policy objectives that they've been pursuing, even in the last 2 decades even. This stretches all the way back to the end of World War II. I've shown people many times on the US State Department's official website, the Office of the Historian, they have documents talking about how they're going to encircle and contain China, that they were in Vietnam fighting the war against the Vietnamese people because it was part of encircling and containing China. They wanted to use Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, India, and Pakistan to encircle and contain China. And it is a policy that, if you really objectively look at it from that point, the 1950s up until now, has continued uninterrupted regardless of who is in the White House. So U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken traveling to Beijing to smooth things over, that was never the intention. That's what they wanted it to look like, but that is not their intention. And we know this because the U.S. has a pattern of doing this. They have a pattern of attempting to portray themselves before the world as the reasonable one, the peacemaker, and whoever it is that they're pretending to try to make peace with, they're the belligerent one. They're the dictatorship, which is exactly why President Biden called Xi Jinping a dictator, and why Antony Blinken doubled down on that. Think about who the audience is. It's not us. We're not the audience. The audience is the American people who are being propagandized right now to hate both Russians and Chinese, to look under their bed for Chinese, look in their closet for Russians. This is their audience. And in their mind, half of the US population thinks President Biden is an agent of the Chinese government, and the other half think that China is actually a dictatorship, has all these human rights abuses, and Taiwan is a poor innocent country that the US should defend, which is all fantasy. But this is what the American people have been convinced on both sides, left and right. So that was the purpose of Blinken going to Beijing, to make it look as if the U.S. is the one trying to make peace, and it's China that's determined to be belligerent, to create conflict. And the U.S., after exhausting its diplomatic options, they're going to have to resort to sanctions and military options, which are already in play and have been years in the making. They're organizing it right now. I'm going to be doing a video soon about both the Council on Foreign Relations and the Atlantic Council, both of them just this month, releasing reports on. The Atlantic Council one is called Sanctioning China in a Taiwan Crisis, Sanctions and Risk. And what is their model? What is their guiding light? It's their sanctions against Russia and how everything is played out in Ukraine. And Council on Foreign Relations, U.S.-Taiwan relations in a new era, responding to a more assertive China. And when you listen to them talk, because you can go find the corresponding videos on YouTube where they have a panel and they talk about these reports, all they talk about is the need to convince the public that these sanctions are going to be painful. That is the reality. But to convince the West that it's necessary and that it's worth enduring the pain. And look at the pain that Europe is enduring right now for the proxy war against Russia. So this is what I'm trying to get across to people. President Biden, his administration, they're not trying to make peace with China. That is not even an option in their head. It's out of the question. When they pretend that that's what they're doing, this is the reason why. It's to portray. And one more thing, I'm kind of rambling on, but this is exactly what they did for Russia. Remember the reset? Hillary Clinton handing the reset button, a literal reset button to the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And as she was doing that, they were engineering the overthrow of the Ukrainian government to create a hostile, Nazi-infested client regime right on Russia's border. That was the so-called reset. And remember, for Iran, it was the U.S.-Iran nuclear deal, which before it was even proposed publicly, the Brookings Institution in a 2009 report, which Path to Persia, they explicitly said, let's make a deal, offer it to Iran, tell the world that they ruined it, we'll sabotage it, but we'll blame it on Iran. And then we can tell the whole world we tried diplomacy, it didn't work, so now we need sanctions and military options. This is the exact same thing they're doing to China right now.
Well, you mentioned the reset button. I pulled up the video. We have to play it because it is it is clownish. It is. But
what year was that? Do you remember? Does it say what year that was?
It looks like 2009. It says yeah, this must have been 2000.
Okay. Yeah, so they already
this was 2000. No, this was 2009, I think, March 7, 2009.
Okay.
It might have been right as, like one of Obama's diplomatic moves, but nonetheless, they were preparing. This comes after I don't think the Obama administration, when it came in, denounced what happened right before the Bush administration left, which was basically indicate that Ukraine would be part of NATO eventually. That's it. And I believe there was color revolution activity in Ukraine right around this time as well. But let's play this because it is hilarious. The gift that keeps on giving, which is Hillary Clinton. Let's play it.
In anticipation of this important meeting and our time here together, I wanted to present you with a little gift which represents what President Obama and Vice President Biden and I have been saying. And that is, we want to reset our relationship. And
let's do it together.
So we will do it together, okay?
So there you go. She hands him a reset button and says, that's what we want to do. We want to reset. Wow, how far things have come. Hillary Clinton ended up being an architect of the coup in Ukraine 2014. And then Biden, Vice President Biden at the time, look at him being the architect of the conflict, essentially, that NATO is waging. So anyway, continue, because this does show the duplicity and the just outright dishonesty. You can't believe anything that the United States says, because look at what's going on with China. The Blinken goes. Now it's getting to the point where it's not even 24 hours after they say something where the complete reverse happens.
And that was 2009. And at that time, because my coverage of the so-called Arab Spring, the U.S. engineered Arab Spring, this regime change campaign that swept North Africa to the Middle East, She was directly involved in preparing the agitators at that time, several years ahead of the 2011 Arab Spring, bringing them to New York, bringing them to other capitals in the West, training them. She would Skype in and talk to them. It was a yearly event, at least one yearly event where they were doing this, and then sending them back to prepare to overthrow their respective countries in 2011. So that was the plan. Think about what the plan was. Why? They eliminated Libya. That was an ally of Russia. Russia was deeply invested in Libya. And that was the beginning of the proxy war in Syria, which, you know, Russia has a base there, and eventually they got dragged into that. That's what they were planning while they were handing this reset button to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. That's what they were doing. And at the same time, like you said, they had been meddling in Ukraine, and they were still meddling in Ukraine, and they still prepared to overthrow the government there and turn it into a militarized, Nazi-infested client regime right on Russia's border. What was that? It was 2008. The whole process in Georgia had already run its course, from regime change to pumping it full of weapons and NATO training, and then the client regime attacking Russian forces in 2008. This is a year later, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we're sorry, we won't do that again," while they were planning the next round of provocations and proxy wars. And they're doing the exact same thing to China. I'm here in Southeast Asia. I'm watching the US try to divide and destroy all of Southeast Asia to disrupt their constructive relationship with China, and then have China surrounded either by obedient US proxy regimes or just failed states or destabilized nations incapable of reaching their full potential and helping China and thus the whole region rise together. I'm watching them do that as Secretary of State Antony Blinken pretends to try to reset relations or smooth over relations in Beijing. That was never a thought that was in any of their heads. It was all a deception, and it's this pattern of trying to portray the U.S. as the rational one, the peacemaker, the innocent victim in all of this, who then has to reluctantly apply sanctions and then go to war with these countries because they left them no choice. That's what this is. It's a pattern that they have repeated over and over again, and that they're in the middle of once again with China.
Yeah, and when Antony Blinken was visiting, I mean, first there was all this impression going around social media saying, "Oh, Blinken's being treated not so well, not getting the red carpet treatment." I mean, he was basically treated how anyone else would have been treated, and it was quite good. And he got to meet with, I mean, they didn't have to do this, but he met with Xi Jinping at the end. He met with Qin Gang, Wang Yi. I mean, these are the senior top diplomats, top leaders in China. But at the end of it, I think he thought that just saying, "Oh, we'll uphold the consensus in Bali at the G20 summit," where Biden and Xi Jinping met on the sidelines and agreed to continue to work through issues. But at the same time, now you have Janet Yellen coming, and similarly, there is such a, I think, superficial and very shallow approach here, where it's like you have mounting aggressive posture and policy against China, where, I mean, just from Janet Yellen's concern, economically, you have the trade war, which predates the Biden administration. No progress on the trade war. You have these sanctions that have kept escalating against China, whether it's through these human rights so-called sanctions that target economic institutions, target economic sectors like China's renewable energy sector. And now you have this export ban on China's semiconductor industry. So technology to China's semiconductor industry is being cut off. The U.S. is trying to pressure countries cut it off. And now you have this looming investment ban that is coming, and it's a Biden executive order where certain sectors of the Chinese economy, certain companies, certain sectors will be banned from investment in, meaning that U.S. companies and potentially even other Western companies, depending on how far the U.S. takes this, will have to think twice before they even conduct any kind of economic relationship. That's a huge escalation. I mean, that is the sanctions escalation ladder. And we're not even talking about the military situation, which literally China said right after the meeting, there has been no reduction in military tensions. Like, there's still ships sailing through the Taiwan Strait. There's still South China Sea tensions. So anyway, your reaction to this part of it, because this doesn't feel like diplomacy at all. This just feels like running interference.
No, it's not. It's what it is the United States trying to give China another chance to think everything over, the deal that they can't refuse. And the deal is, you will subordinate yourself to us, or we're going to just continue doing what we're doing with the military, the economy, and everything. And all they talk about in these panel discussions at the Atlantic Council, the Council on Foreign Relations, this is where U.S. foreign policy is actually created. This is where they reach consensus. They write these policy papers. They have teams of lawyers come in, transform it into a bill. They send it to Washington with lobbyists, have it signed off by everyone there, many of whom don't even bother reading it. And they also send it to their partners in the Western media to convince the public that this is something that is absolutely necessary. And that's how U.S. foreign policy is actually created. And what are they doing right now? They are getting this sanction war laid out, and they are talking about how to build consensus among the public, and also between themselves and their allies. They already saw what happened with Russia, but they have no other plan. There's no other alternative plan. So even though they're lying to themselves about how it went with Russia, they're not facing the reality of how those sanctions actually really went, and they're getting ready to do it to China. So this isn't diplomacy. They're not listening to China. They're talking at China. They're not talking with China. China's place is beneath the United States and the collective West. That's how it's always been throughout generations. The West cannot even imagine any sort of alternative where a non-white nation, and that's what this is about, a non-white nation surpassing not just the U.S., but the collective West, which is what's happening. That is what is happening, and they cannot tolerate that. They cannot accept that, and they are making irrational decisions and pursuing irrational foreign policy objectives to try to prevent this from happening, despite all of the metrics back in reality saying that what they're trying to do doesn't make any sense and is impossible. But they're going to try to do it anyway. Look at these people and just ask yourself, look at the panels, the Council on Foreign Relations panel, or anyone involved in the Atlantic Council, these warmongers, these elitists. Just ask yourself, are they capable of any sort of humility, the ability to acknowledge that there is something greater than them, and that they should at least have mutual respect for another nation? They're incapable of it. It is something inside their brain that they are physically, psychologically incapable of, and they're going to plunge the West into a destructive confrontation one way or the other with China. They're already doing it. They're actually already doing it with China. They're going to escalate it with China. That's where we are right now.
Well, I wanted to share this because you mentioned the lack of humility and just how there is this consensus in the U.S. political and foreign policy establishment. But there's also this consensus in the media. I mean, look at the way that the media portrays the U.S.-China tensions. Here you have the New York Times basically saying, would Americans allow the Biden administration to reduce tensions? And so basically what it's saying is that Americans' views of China are resembling their view of the Soviet Union decades ago, and that is what's going to make it harder to mend ties. And then they, this pollster over at the New York Times publishes these polls, right, with the increasing dissatisfaction of the Soviet Union in the mid-40s after World War II, where you have this massive jump in dissatisfaction. And then you have here from 2014 to 2023, you start at 2014, it's around 50-55% unfavorable, and then boom, jumps during the Trump administration to nearly 80%. And look at that jump during the Biden administration. I mean, this is 2023, where unfavorable views are now in, it looks like it's getting up to the 90% range, mid 80s, 90%. But that is how the New York Times is portraying this. It's Americans that are keeping the Biden administration
Democracy.
from doing this. Yeah, it's democracy keeping the Biden administration from alleviating tensions. However, now you have a delegation. You have a U.S. Congress, a U.S. House delegation, right, as part of this so-called committee against the Communist Party, the Armed Services Committee. Chairman is in Taiwan right now, Mike Rogers, and he's going to be there for 3 days. This is another escalation of just at this question alone. But we just said that Taiwan, it's all part of this larger strategy. What's your take? Now, this is another crossing of China's red line too. So as you have the media blaming Americans for their anti-China sentiment, and pushing anti-China and aggressive policy towards China, you have literally U.S. politicians touching down on Taiwan and violating the one China principle.
Well, I wonder if there's a graph that you could find that would show us the amount of money spent by the U.S. government on anti-China propaganda, because we have definitely seen a leap in anti-China propaganda. We've covered this for years now. The so-called Uyghur genocide in Xinjiang. This is to China what WMDs was to Iraq. It's just this completely fabricated story. It's actually the result of U.S.-sponsored terrorism inside of China that China was reacting to. And they don't tell you about the terrorism. They just show the reaction. And then they also lie about it to make it as if there's some sort of genocide taking place. And they have been hammering this into the American people's minds for years and years now. That, Tibet, even longer, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the media operation has only expanded. They admitted that they were going to set aside millions and millions of dollars for media specifically targeting China. They made an announcement where they actually talked about this. And then it's no surprise that the American people are now anti-China. Obviously, they're going to be anti-China because they're in an environment where everything they hear is anti-China. So it's interesting how the New York Times, which is definitely a willing and deliberate party to this propaganda campaign, they're saying, oh, the American people have spoken. The U.S. government's hands are tied. There's nothing they can do. The American people demand this. The American people demand this because you've poisoned their minds deliberately with a concerted media campaign to poison them against China. That's why. So this is the joke. When I said democracy, it's absolutely in reverse. It is the government putting these ideas into the people's heads and then pretending that somehow it was generated by the people. Again, it starts in these think tanks, it goes off to Washington to be rubber stamped, and it goes to their media partners to be drummed into the minds of the American people. So that's where we are right now. This is the propaganda campaign that they've invested in for years now, finally paying off. Yes, now everyone hates China. How many Americans actually know anything about China? How many have gone to China? How many have actually watched a video with no commentary, just watched a video, someone with a 4K camera just walking through the streets of China? I guarantee you that it's probably single-digit percentile. They know nothing about China except what they see on CNN, on Fox, on the BBC. And we know that these are all verified serial liars. So that's one aspect of it. I don't remember your other question. You had another question, Danny, but I can't remember. That part, the New York Times acting as if the American, we have to listen to the American people. Like, that part is just so absurd, but this is what they always do. I guarantee you, China is not the first thing the New York Times is telling the truth about. I guarantee you they're lying about that. We've proven that they're lying about these things. What was the other part of the question, Danny?
As you were talking, I mean, you were mentioning the millions of dollars that the United States is pouring into literal anti-China propaganda. I believe it was last year, in February, there was an addition of like $500 million set aside for Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, all of these CIA cutouts, to pour into them money for China misinformation, essentially. And so, yeah, it's a very real phenomenon. But the other side of this is, as the New York Times is blaming the Americans, blaming people in the United States who are literally just listening and ingesting whenever they're paying attention, which honestly is not too much. But for those who are paying attention, who end up being subjects in these polls, they're watching as U.S. politicians. Now you have the head of the U.S. Armed Services Committee, Mike Rogers. He is now in Taiwan. So this follows
yes, Taiwan,
Kevin McCarthy. Yeah,
Yes.
he follows Kevin McCarthy, following Kevin McCarthy's visit with Tsai Ing-wen here in the United States, following Nancy Pelosi's, of course, landmark visit. You also had on the UK side, Liz Truss has visited. There's been many instances where the collective West, with the U.S. spearheading this, is crossing this red line. And I mean, to do that, and of course, all the propaganda that surrounds Taiwan alone, right? Because Taiwan is framed as this country. It's not a country, but this country that's being aggressively bullied by China, and the U.S. is going in there to assert democratic values. So your reaction to this latest crossing of China's red line?
Yes, that was the second part. It was about Taiwan. So one of the components of this visit by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was him publicly reciting the U.S. One China policy. What is the One China policy? It is the United States recognizing officially that there is only one China. Taiwan is part of China. There's only one legitimate government in China. It's the People's Republic of China in Beijing. And if you go to the U.S. State Department's website right now on U.S. relations with Taiwan, they will say explicitly, we do not recognize Taiwan independence. We don't support Taiwan independence, something to that effect. And yet at the exact same time they're doing that, acknowledging China's sovereignty over Taiwan, they are blatantly violating China's sovereignty over Taiwan by sending these people from Congress to Taiwan without Beijing's approval to encourage separatism on the island province of Taiwan. They're also sending weapons to Taiwan. Could you imagine if there was some breakaway region inside the continental US or right off the coast, and China was saying, well, we recognize that as American, and then they're sending weapons. They've handcrafted the government that is leading it, that is pursuing separatism. Nobody would tolerate that for a moment, and yet this is exactly what the United States is doing. So as the U.S. is pretending to be diplomatic and trying to smooth over ties with China, they are deliberately and blatantly violating Chinese sovereignty regarding Taiwan. So that again, that is what I've been saying. And they know that China is going to react to that. So what is the American people who are being lied to, who the U.S. sets aside hundreds of millions of dollars every year to lie to them about China? How are they going to see this? They're going to see Blinken going to Beijing, trying to extend the olive branch, and then they're going to see China complaining about Taiwan, which American people know nothing about and don't understand. Again, I talk to American people who think Taiwan is a country, and as Carl Za often says, if they even can differentiate it from Thailand, that would be amazing if they could even do that. And so this is the problem. And they're doing the exact same thing that they did to Russia and Iran. They pretend, they do this song and dance that they're pursuing peace with these nations while blatantly, deliberately violating their national security and their sovereignty, trying to provoke them and then point at them and say, look, we were the peacemakers. Look at how irrational and belligerent they are. Unfortunately, we have to apply sanctions. Unfortunately, we need to prepare for war with this country. That it is the U.S. In violation of international law, provoking and violating the sovereignty of.
Yeah, I mean, there really is no question about it, and it was quite a set. This is, generally you hear Biden and Blinken in the past and others say, oh yeah, no, we're still for the one China policy, one China principle, but you don't necessarily see it recited. And in Blinken's readout, in his post Beijing visit presser to the media, he did list it out. He talked about the 3 joint communiques, the 6 assurances, and all that has transpired since the infamous Nixon visit, where this all started to be rolled out and agreed upon. Yet you don't really hear Biden and Blinken necessarily oppose the actions of what their counterparts. And this is this could be framed as a partisan issue. It is not a partisan issue, but it could be framed if the Biden administration truly wanted it to be, because it is now, given the shape of Congress, it is the GOP that essentially is spearheading all of these dangerous visits to Taiwan and stomping on China's red line on this question. What do you make of this? Maybe we can close the China discussion here on, like, why do you feel like Biden and Blinken do not speak up? Because on the one hand, it could be argued that this makes them look politically weak in the face of their opposition. So why would they want to be in that position?
I think the U.S. uses its two-party system to as a smokescreen, as plausible deniability, where they can say, well, we're trying to make peace with Beijing, but it's, the other party, we have absolutely no control over them, violating both U.S. and international law. We're powerless to stop them from doing this. We're also powerless from stopping the flow of weapons and the sailing of warships all along China's coast. Utterly powerless when the president is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. Could all easily be stopped, but they're not doing it. They're not doing it on purpose. It's just like when President Obama, signing the U.S.-Iran nuclear deal. From the very beginning, it was designed to fail. It was a trick, essentially. And you had the right wing in American politics, or whatever you want to call it, the Republicans. That is a political minefield there. But whatever you want to call it, they were constantly aggressive, belligerent toward Iran. They kept the hatred toward Iran going, so that you have these dynamics where they're still the bad guy. No one did, because they don't want the American people to think that there actually is peace developing. They want to keep that hatred going. Someone has to do that. It can't be President Obama and his political party. They're pretending to be peacemakers. So it's a very convenient arrangement that they have. And we know that it doesn't matter who's in the White House, who's in Congress. There's continuity of agenda for these foreign policy objectives. Like I said, you go to the U.S. State Department's official website. They have papers that if you read it, it's from the 1950s. If you read it, it sounds like something that you could have heard yesterday on CNN or Fox News.
Thanks for watching the video, and please consider liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing to the channel. Thank you very much.